This is not a regular parish church. It's the Cathedral of St. Peter and Chains in Peterborough. And a cathedral is the main church for a bishop. And that the cathedral is named after the cathedra, which is a chair, a seat. It's where the seat of the bishop is. So wherever the cathedra is, that is a cathedral. So this is the main center for the entire diocese of Peterborough. And it is, Peterborough is an almost diocese, we say. It goes almost to Oshawa, almost to Trenton, almost to Orillia, and almost to North Bay.
What is the connection between St. Peter and Chains Cathedral and Nine Ships 1825? You are kind of working in concert with their Heritage Fair, August 1st to 10th, but why?
Well, I have a personal connection. I'm 7/8 descended from the settlers that came over in 1825 on both sides. And so I have that personal connection. But the reality is that the roughly 2,500 settlers were overwhelmingly Catholic, overwhelmingly. And so they actually had a priest that was waiting for them to come here, Father Crowley, who was sort of loaned from a diocese. And one of the very first things they needed was a priest. And Crowley was actually here. Crowley and then a priest called Ahern were actually here. So a large part of the story of the coming of these settlers centers around the church and with the church. There was about 8 or 9 million people in Ireland at the time. By 1845, a third had starved to death, a third had emigrated, and Ireland's never really recovered. And do remember that at the time in Ireland, they were shipping grains, wheat and corn, they call it, not our corn, over to England. But they often had to do it under armed guard to do it because the people were starving. So there was a problem, two problems really. One problem was the starving Irish, and the second was that this land was empty and the Americans were just next door. So the British government decided to try to kill two birds with one stone. They got a young man from New Brunswick who was quite an outstanding young man called Peter Robinson, and he led a small group up to Renfrew in 1823. That was the practice run. And then he applied for people to come to Canada. We still have some of the original posters, the emigration to Canada. And he said he was going to take about 2,500. 50,000 people applied. And we have all their letters of application. And so some won the lottery. You might think it's an odd prize. They sailed from both Cork and the very south of Ireland in May 1825. They got here in August. And it was a tough go. They had to be transshipped up the St. Lawrence. There was no St. Lawrence Seaway. They came up here, but the land was surveyed, and you were going to get 150 acres of free land. It was like winning a lottery, right? There was beyond belief wealth. And they were given animals, they were given rations for 2 years, they were given tools. And so the men immediately went off to the land, because if they felled 2 acres and built a house, not much of a house, a shanty, it was yours. And if boys were 16 and girls were 15, they could be married. There were a lot of early marriages, and they could get double the land. So it was unbelievable wealth, desperately hard work, new illnesses, new sicknesses. It was tough. One of my ancestors almost made it here to North America. He died on board the boat, and they hid his body for 3 days till they got to land, so he wouldn't be buried at sea. But that's what they did. And so they came here, 1825. And they didn't have a lot of time to get established because it was August. But that winter, they made an application to the governor who was here. And they said, we need 2 main things out of all the thank yous. Send us priests for the consolation of our holy religion, and teachers to be able to educate the minds and the intellect of our children. So they made a deal, the settlers, and they built these schools, which were also churches. They built 14 of them in the next 10 to 12 years. Some burnt, some weren't built very well, etc. But that's how many they built. And then they also built a church here. It was down in the end of Simcoe Street, church/school. It wasn't much good. One burnt and another, so many burnt because of the chimneys catching on fire, etc. And so then for a good while, they had the mass up on what we now think of as the courthouse, because it was very, very ecumenical at the time. But then almost incredibly, in 1837, they built this. And they built it. They built it themselves. They had collected stones for 2 years. If anybody knows the Peterborough area, we got lots of stones. They cut the stone themselves over in what is now Jackson's Creek in the quarry. They burned some of it over a year or so to make lime for the mortar. They transported it all here. and they had to do it in the wintertime. They couldn't come in the summer. They think they got an architect from Toronto, but otherwise they built it themselves. And it's said that the women actually did most of the mortaring because they had a more delicate hand. And so if you go outside, you'll see the original stones that they cut, they mortared, and they raised. They put fires on the ground to take out the frost. They brought the stones, and they made the foundation, and boy, they are big foundations. Then they kept fires going as they built up the walls, because mortar has to cure for 72 hours and it can't freeze. They kept the fires going in braziers, and they built up the walls, and they did it themselves with their own materials. That's how important they thought it was. This is the original building, the oldest building in all of the diocese, and it was the first parish. It was made a parish in 1825, and the first recorded mass was 1826.
Remarkable.
It is astonishing that these people, who were living hand to mouth, it was subsistence farming. They said, we have a letter, we have lots of letters that were sent back home. One said, oh, there's lots of trees. Little did they know there were too many trees, because there are almost no trees in Ireland. But they were living hand to mouth, and they thought it was so important that they came in and lived in tents for the winter and built this.
This is the cathedral. You are used to having people in here often, and definitely on the weekends, but you're doing an open house. What are you hoping to show or share? What does somebody do in a cathedral tour?
Well, cathedral tour is really, I think, the story of how it was built and why it was built. And then it isn't a question that it was just something that's done once and forgotten. It's been constantly rebuilt. In fact, we're in the middle of a restoration right now, but it's to show some of our continuing history. And I think the history, not just of the Catholics, but really of the whole area, to show what these people were like. We look back in history and we think of them as just figures and images, but they were real people. And yet what was important to them? You show what's important by what you do. And so this was important to them. So we want to show off what I think to be a jewel of that pre-Victorian architecture, but also what is being kept up and I think should be a point of pride and joy for all the city of Peterborough, indeed the whole area even now.